At 2:46 a.m., I woke to the sound of breathing. Slow, steady, and far too close. And when my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw the pale outline of a man standing in the corner of our bedroom, his head tilted slightly like he was studying us in our sleep. But when I screamed and fumbled for the lamp, the light revealed nothing except our clothes hanging limply on the chair and the faint sway of the curtains in the night breeze. And yet, even then, the smell of damp earth and stale. Sweat lingered in the room as if he'd really been there. 2 weeks earlier, Daniel and I had been overjoyed to move into what we thought was our dream home. A quaint little brick house on a quiet street with a small back garden that bordered a line of overgrown trees. The kind of place where you'd expect neighbors to bring you cookies and wave from their porches. But our attention was drawn almost immediately to the property behind ours. A tall, narrow house with faded paint, blinds permanently drawn, and a yard choked with weeds. It wasn't abandoned exactly, but it had that unlived-in feeling, and though we occasionally saw signs of activity, like an overflowing bin on garbage day or a light switching on upstairs after midnight, we never saw anyone enter or leave. We joked about it at first, calling it the ghost house, until one afternoon when Daniel came in from mowing the lawn looking unsettled and told me he'd seen a figure in the upstairs window watching him. Later that evening, I caught sight of the same thing, just a dark silhouette behind the blinds, still and silent, staring toward our garden. And even though I told myself it was probably just a curious neighbor, something about how long they stood there made my skin prickle. The days passed quietly enough, but little things began to gnaw at us. Our side gate swinging open in the morning when we'd locked it the night before, garden tools moved a few feet from where we'd left them, and our cat Clover hissing toward the back fence for no reason. Then, about a week in, I was watering the herbs near the fence when a pale hand gripped the top, followed by a man's head slowly rising into view. His hair was messy, his eyes wide and unblinking, and he didn't speak or smile, just looked at me for several seconds before dropping back down. That night, while we were brushing our teeth, there came 3 deliberate knocks on the back door, evenly spaced. Daniel checked but found no one there, only a small pile of pebbles neatly arranged on the step which we swept away in uneasy silence. The following days brought more of the same. Strange knocks at odd hours, fleeting glimpses of movement in the overgrown yard, the creak of the old fence under unseen weight. Until one evening, I was alone in the kitchen, and Clover started growling, low, staring at the window above the sink. And when I looked, the pale man was standing in our garden, his head tilted just like I would see weeks later in our bedroom, his expression empty, unmoving, as if memorizing my face. I dropped the mug I was holding, but by the time I looked again, he was gone, leaving only the faint sway of the grass where he'd stood. Her fingernails were still embedded in the wood when I found her, the deep grooves carved into the splintering door frame, as if she had tried to climb her way out of hell itself, her eyes wide open, unblinking, the pupils blown so large they swallowed. The color. Her mouth locked into a silent scream that seemed to echo in the air long after I realized she wasn't breathing. And I swear, even before I touched her, I felt something watching me from inside the dark hallway behind that door, something that didn't belong in this world, something that had been there with her when she died. Only later did I realize that by the time I found her, it had already started watching me too. And the worst part is, I had been the one to bring it here, though at the time, when we first moved into the old house at the edge of town, I thought the only thing we'd have to worry about was the leaking roof and the occasional rat in the basement. But that was before I started hearing the footsteps at night, slow, deliberate steps pacing just outside our bedroom door. Before I started noticing the doors were never exactly where I'd left them, before the mirrors began showing things that weren't in the room at all, and before she began talking to someone in the middle of the night who I couldn't see, but could damn well hear. A wet, rasping voice that seemed to bubble up from the walls themselves, and I wish I could say I took the signs seriously earlier. But we laughed them off at first, told ourselves it was just the stress of the move, the creaks and groans of an old house settling. Except the house didn't just settle. It shifted. It seemed to breathe. The air would thicken some nights until it felt like you were wading through invisible water. And in those moments you could hear it, faint at first, like someone whispering a word you almost understood but didn't quite catch. And she told me once in the early hours when neither of us could sleep that it wasn't whispering to her. It was whispering her name, over and over, and she didn't think it was trying to scare her. She thought it was trying to convince her, to come closer, to follow it, and I remember getting angry at her for even talking like that, for letting herself believe the house was alive, but inside, I was already afraid because I'd been hearing it too. Only mine didn't whisper my name. It laughed, quiet at first, but each night a little louder until one night it was standing right next to me in the dark. Its breath cold enough to make frost bloom on the mirror across the room, and I didn't move, didn't breathe, because I knew if I did, I'd feel it touch me. And after that night, things changed. She started staying in the upstairs study until the early hours, said she liked the quiet up there. But I could hear her pacing above me, whispering back to whatever was in that room. And sometimes the pacing would stop suddenly, and I'd hear something heavy dragging across the floor, like furniture. But when I'd check in the morning, nothing would be out of place except for the dust on the floor, which would have deep, wide trails through it, like something had been pulled away from the walls and then pushed back. And then came the smell. Sweet at first, almost floral, but underneath it was something rancid, something like meat left in the sun, and it clung to her clothes, her hair, even though she swore she couldn't smell it at all. And I kept telling myself that if I could just get her out of the house for a few days, she'd come back to herself. But she didn't want to leave. Said she was closer than ever to finding out what it wanted. And one night she asked me, dead serious, what I'd do if she disappeared, if I'd follow her into the walls, and I laughed it off because the question was insane. But now, standing here, staring at her lifeless body frozen in terror, I think that's exactly what happened. I think she followed it, and I think whatever she found is still in there, waiting for me to open the door just a little wider to let it finish what it started. By the time I realized the thing wearing my mother's face wasn't my mother, it was already sitting at the foot of my bed, its eyes two wet pits of black that didn't reflect any light, and the sound it made when it smiled, if you can call. That expression, a smile, was like meat sliding across wet tile. The smell hit me next, a rotting sweetness that didn't belong to anything alive, and yet it leaned closer. Its voice a perfect imitation of hers, asking me in the same sing-song tone she used when I was a child, "Do you remember the door in the attic, sweetie?" My stomach clenched so hard I thought I'd throw up, and every hair on my arm stood on end, because I had never told anyone, not even my real mother, that I'd found a small, padlocked door hidden behind the insulation up there the week we moved in. My mind was trying to catch up, to make sense of how this thing knew, but it was too late for sense. The hallway light flickered, and when it came back, the thing was gone, though the mattress was still warm where it had been sitting. I lay there, shaking so hard the bed frame tapped against the wall, and I knew there was no point trying to convince myself it had been a dream, because I could still hear the faint scratching from the ceiling above me, steady, deliberate, and moving toward the spot where I knew the hidden door was. But that wasn't where the nightmare started. No, this began 3 months earlier, when we moved into the old Ashford place, the one every local avoided mentioning, and the real horror wasn't that the place was haunted. It was that something in it had been waiting for us, and it already knew my name. We'd been desperate for a fresh start. My father had died in a car accident the year before, and my mother, my real mother, was a shadow of herself, moving through each day as if the air had grown thick enough to choke her. The house was an inheritance from a great uncle I'd never met, a creaking Victorian monstrosity at the edge of town, its windows like dark eyes and its roof line jagged against the sky. The realtor had smiled too much while handing us the keys. Her grip cold, her eyes sliding to the floor when my mother asked why the property had been vacant for so long. We moved in on a rainy Thursday, the kind where the sky feels low enough to press on your skull. Even then, I noticed the smell inside. Not quite mold, not quite rot, but a cloying heavy scent like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The rooms were huge, but wrong somehow. The corners darker than they should have been even with the lights on, and the silence seemed to absorb our voices instead of carrying them. I told myself it was just old house vibes, but on the second night, lying in bed, I heard it for the first time. 3 slow knocks from somewhere above the ceiling. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. That's what everyone says about old houses, right? But it wasn't random. The knocks came in threes, always perfectly spaced, and always between 2:15 and 2:20 a.m. I didn't tell my mother because she already had too much to carry, and I didn't want her thinking I was spooked. A week later, I went up to the attic to find a box for some winter clothes. The air up there was thick and hot, smelling faintly of the same sweetness that lingered in the halls. And that's when I saw a section of insulation bulged outward unnaturally. I pulled it back, and there it was. A small, warped wooden door, maybe 2 feet high, with a rusted padlock clamped on it. It didn't make sense. We were on the top floor, so there shouldn't have been any more space beyond that wall. I ran, my hand over it, and felt an odd vibration, almost like the hum of a running machine. My first instinct was to leave it alone, and that's exactly what I did. I wished to God I had left the attic for good that day, because after that, the house started noticing me back. The noises changed. It wasn't just the knocks anymore. I started hearing whispers, not words I could understand, but the cadence of someone speaking low, almost coaxing, coming from directly over my bed. Then came the shadows. I'd see them dart across doorways when no one else was home, or standing at the far end of the hallway just long enough for me to blink and lose them. And my mother, she began to change. She'd spend hours in her room, sometimes talking softly as if to someone else, sometimes just sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at the wall. I caught her once standing in the hallway at 2:17 a.m., head tilted toward the ceiling, her lips moving soundlessly. When I called her name, she turned to me with a look I can only describe as wrong. The eyes were hers, but there was no recognition in them for a solid 2 seconds before she blinked and smiled like nothing had happened.